The Ukrainian offensive, which I will continue to call the offensive because I feel that that is what it is, even though Ukraine has made no reference to the fact that it is engaged in an offensive and in fact denies that it is doing so, and even though the Western media doesn't report it as an offensive. But the Ukrainian offensive, which was launched over the weekend, seems for the moment to be in certain abeyance. Now, over the course of yesterday, Ukraine made another attempt to attack and capture Novodonetskoye, town that the small village that Ukraine successfully captured, but only briefly during the intense fighting on Monday. The Russians recaptured it over the course of the following day, on Tuesday, and Ukraine in the evening made another attempt to take it back from the Russians. However, it seems that the Ukrainian forces that were committed to this particular attack were smaller in number, and unlike on the previous occasion, they did not come in large numbers of armoured vehicles, probably smaller groups of soldiers, and the Russians in the event appear to have had no difficulty causing them to retreat. There have been other Ukrainian attacks at sporadic places along the Zaporozhye front line, but nothing so far of any particular significance. I'm going to discuss later in this program a discussion of the Ukrainian attacks that began over the weekend and continued through Monday and Tuesday, an account that's been provided by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. In the meantime, Ukraine has also been attacking in various other places. There was an attack in Avdiivka and in Lugansk region. Again, it's difficult to get complete information about what's going on in all of these places, but my overall sense is that, again, the various Ukrainian attacks, carried out mainly by light infantry, by the way, have all been unsuccessful. In other words, Ukraine has expended lives and equipment carrying out what might be called frontal assaults with little preparation, little artillery preparation, next to no air cover over several days to no particular purpose or effect, or at least to no effect. Now, I say all of this because, of course, these attacks continue to be referred to in the West as shaping operations. As I said, I cannot see that they're shaping or changing the situation on the battlefields to any great extent. They're simply killing people, perhaps in large numbers, if the Russians are to be believed. But anyway, that is what they're doing. Now, having said that, as I said, I will come back to a more detailed discussion of events on the battlefields over the next few hours. But first of all, I'm going to return again to the topic of the attack on the Novaya Kakhovka dam. And I would like, first of all, to acknowledge a great deal of invaluable information provided to me by members of the Duran community. And I'm going to discuss some of this information shortly over the course of my further attempts to try to get some idea as to what actually has happened and what its long-term effects might be. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to certain comments made by each side about the nature of the attack and its consequences, and the reason why each side claims that the other was responsible. And I'm going to start with Ukraine because the Ukrainians have provided a fair amount of information and at least commentary about what has happened. There is, by the way, an ongoing meeting of the United Nations Security Council where all this is being discussed as well, though it doesn't seem as if anything is going to come of the matter. I'll discuss in a moment why. But anyway, this is what Ukraine has been saying about the purpose of the attack on the dam, which they insist is the responsibility of the Russians. And on that, by the way, the major charge has been made by President Zelensky. He's quoted, and I'm taking most of these quotes now from an article in the Financial Times. It is physically impossible to blow it up somehow from the outside with shelling. This is Zelensky's words. It was mined. It was mined by the Russian occupiers and blown up by them. Russia detonated a bomb of mass environmental damage. This is the biggest man-made environmental disaster in Europe in decades. Now, note what Zelensky says, that this dam could not have been blown up by external agency, that it could only have been mined, and the only people who could have mined it are the Russians. Well, the trouble with that claim is that it contradicts things that Ukrainian officials have in fact been saying for many, many months. And again, I'm not going to go into detail over this. There's been an awful lot of people who've gone through the various articles that have been published over the last few months since last summer, in which all sorts of Ukrainian officials and military officers have discussed ideas about destroying the Novaya Kakhovka dam, particular emphasis to a Ukrainian military official called Mr. Kovalyuk, who openly discussed at one point various scenarios for destroying the dam and the benefits Ukraine would accrue from doing so. This was, it must be said, some time ago. They date from the autumn. And, of course, and to reiterate again, Ukraine has had a history of shelling the dam and launching missile strikes against the dam, and for quite a long time, not only did not deny doing so, but actually bragged about it. So I would take what Zelensky says here with a healthy dollop of salt. As I said, perhaps he's ignorant of what his own officials have been saying, or perhaps, somewhat more plausibly, he's decided to ignore it. But anyway, this is what the Financial Times has to say about the effect of the attack on the dam upon their plans, and why they allege that it was the Russians who was responsible. And this is what the Financial Times says. Some military analysts and Ukrainian officials say the timing of the dam's destruction is suspicious. This is about the only part of this article, by the way, with which I am straightforwardly in agreement, as it largely benefits Russia by scuppering Kiev's plans to attack to the south and increasing the likelihood of an eastward offensive that Moscow could focus on. The purpose is obvious: to create insurmountable obstacles in the way of the advancing Ukrainian armed forces, said Mikhailo Podolyak, a top advisor to Zelensky. And we then go on to read that the dam breach will complicate Ukrainian planning, and now the Financial Times turns to the words of a Ukrainian military official. A Ukrainian military official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said officials were assessing the damage caused by the flooding and would adjust their counteroffensive plans accordingly. If we had any plans for an landing operation there, we definitely won't do it anytime soon. Immediately after the flooding, the land will be a marsh, essentially. And then there's a quotation from Andrei Zagorodnyuk, a military advisor and former Ukrainian defense minister. And he said it was likely that Kiev's generals had alternative plans. The flooding may be a setback, but it won't stop Ukraine's counteroffensive. If we wanted to cross the river there, it's not going to happen. Basically, it denies any ability for us to cross the river and move equipment in that area. Basically, that's why most likely Russia did it, particularly now. And we also read that Ukraine's Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security, which is a Ukrainian government agency, said it was possible Russian forces also blew up the dam in order to flood islands downstream, which it said had been recaptured by Ukrainian troops on Monday. Well, I've not heard anything about that capture, but there's been fighting on the islands in the estuary for a very long time, and it seems that the Ukrainians have been forced to evacuate those soldiers on those islands in a great rush. But I won't say more about this, and besides, I think that the importance of these islands in the greater scheme of things can be overrated. So that's the Ukrainian explanation, that the Russians blew up the dam in order to flood the area south of the dam, create a larger estuary, create swampy ground. That makes it impossible for the Ukrainians to launch an amphibious assault on the Russian-controlled areas of Kherson region across the Dnieper. This plan, which, by the way, the Ukrainians implicitly admit to in this article, from the quotations made in this article, this plan has, for the time being, become impossible. Now, you will find buried in the article certain claims, specifically by a gentleman called Pavel Luzhin, who is a visiting professor at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he also goes along with Zelensky's theory that the dam could only have been blown up from the inside and would have been left largely undamaged by artillery strikes. I am not going to discuss this issue at this point. All I will say is I disagree. But he says that he does say that Russia's position would likely be worse affected than Ukraine's in the long term. The water will flow away in a few days, and it's the Russian positions on the left bank that are flooded. And this has also been said by several people, also on the Russian side, that not Russian military officials, but commentators and bloggers, that when the waters recede, the minefields and the fortifications that the Russians created close to the riverbank will have been flooded and destroyed, and that will make a Ukrainian amphibious operation easier in the long term. Well, that may be true, but I will say that it's not the reason the Russian officials, the Russian Defense Ministry, is giving for this attack, that, it's intended to disrupt, in the longer term, Russian defenses. The argument that it's a claim made by Russian bloggers and commentators. And as I've said already, it seems to me that the Russians have always been conscious of the risks that the Kakhovka Dam would be breached at some point, Novaya Kakhovka Dam would be breached at some point, And there is a significant amount of information that, in fact, the Russians developed minefields and fortifications further inland as a perhaps even stronger second line of defence, allowing for precisely this eventuality. Moreover, I can't help but think that if and when the waters do eventually recede, the Russians will, at that point, use whatever time they have available to plant more minefields again. As I understand it, planting minefields is not doesn't take a particularly long time, and the Russians have special expertise in this. But anyway, essentially, what the Ukrainians are saying is, yes, we did have a plan for an amphibious landing on the Russian-controlled parts of Kherson region on the east bank, but these have been thwarted by the destruction of the Kakhovka dam, and that is why the Russians destroyed it. They destroyed it so that we would not be able to carry out this particular operation. It's now, at least for the time being, an impossible operation for us to carry out. So that's the Ukrainian version of events. The Russians have provided their own, and it comes from General Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, who published a statement which has appeared on the website of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And it says the following, and it was published yesterday. It says, tonight, the Kiev regime committed another terrorist act. The Kakhovka hydroelectric station facilities were blown up, flooding a large area. The purpose of these actions is reportedly as follows. Having failed to succeed in the offensive operations, the enemy intends to redeploy the units and hardware from Kherson direction to its offensive area in order to strengthen its potential, significantly weakening its positions in the Kherson direction. The enemy has begun building defensive positions on the right bank, the west bank in other words, of the Dnieper River, which indicates the intention to turn to defense there. In order to prevent Russia's offensive actions in this area of the front, the Kiev regime has carried out a sabotage, essentially a terrorist act, which has resulted in the flooding of significant areas and will have serious and long-lasting environmental consequences. In addition, the release of water from the Dnieper hydroelectric station, that's one further upstream and which is controlled by Ukraine, according to available data, has been significantly increased, leading to even greater flooding of areas. This fact proves that the large-scale diversion was planned in advance by the Kiev regime. And the last point is an important one, and I'm going to come to it later. But this is Shoigu's account. The offensive Ukraine has been launching in Zaporozhye region and in southern Donbass is not going well. Ukraine has suffered very heavy losses. They need to reinforce their forces in this area in order to have any prospect of a breakthrough. They are now becoming overextended themselves because of presumably the losses they've been suffering over the many months of, well, year and a half of the fighting. And so they've decided to redeploy the forces that they had in Kherson region and which had been allocated the task of carrying out this amphibious operation. They've decided to reallocate these forces and to transfer them to the main axis of advance, which is in Zaporozhye region. And they're going to go on the defensive in Kherson region. Now, this appears to exclude, by the way, the possibility of Ukraine launching an attack across the Dnieper at any time in the foreseeable future. So, even if the water dries out, the Ukrainians are no longer planning to carry out this offensive operation, because this amphibious operation across the Dnieper that they had originally planned, they're going on to the defensive in Kherson region, and they are transferring their troops east to Zaporozhye and Donbass. And other Russian officials, notably our old friend Vladimir Rogov, who is an official of the Zaporozhye regional government, says that already around 10,000 Ukrainian troops are being transferred from Kherson region to Zaporozhye in order to strengthen the Ukrainian forces that are currently conducting the offensive. Now, is there any truth to this? I'm going to say straight away that there might be, though I don't know that it is the truth. Presumably, Shoigu is reasonably well informed about Ukrainian troop deployments. It may be that the Ukrainians have indeed come to the conclusion that an amphibious landing on the flanks of the Russian forces across the Dnieper is effectively impossible. Attempting to do that would fail in light of the heavy Russian fortifications in this area. They've never really been able to consolidate control of Kherson city itself. The city is well within range of Russian guns across on the east bank. Ukrainian forces have been repeatedly shelled in Kherson region. There was another report only today in TASS, on the TASS, the Russian TASS news agency, about how the Russians have shelled more Ukrainian troops in Kherson region, killing or wounding a further 70. Again, these are Russian claims. And in light of this, the Ukrainians might have decided, it's conceivable, they might have decided that this flank attack across the Dnieper is no longer possible, makes no further sense. So let's withdraw our troops from Kherson region, but let's not create a vacuum there. We need to keep some troops, obviously, to continue to retain control of Kherson region on the west bank, and we need to create some fortifications to defend our positions there. But this is not going to be enough if we're going to withdraw the best part of this army group from Kherson region. So let's blow up the dam and let's flood the area, and that will make it impossible for the Russians to carry out their own assault across the Dnieper to recapture Kherson city and its environs. Well, it's Shoigu's idea. It might be true. And bear in mind, he probably has a lot more intelligence, information about what the Ukrainians are planning and thinking than any of the multiplicity of our commentators who have discussed this matter on the internet, in the pages of the newspapers and elsewhere. So, which of these is the more plausible? That the Russians blew up the dam in order to prevent a Ukrainian crossing, or that the Ukrainians blew up the dam in order to prevent a Russian crossing? Note that each side attributes, or each side is supposed to fear offensive operations across the Dnieper by the other. Well, I have to say that up to this point, I've not seen any real sign that the Russians, for their part, were planning any offensive operations across the Dnieper. But of course, if Ukrainian troops had withdrawn en masse from Kherson region, leaving it exposed, the Russians might perhaps have been tempted to cross the Dnieper and reoccupy Kherson region and all those other territories that they withdrew from back in the autumn. Having said that, I can't really believe that this was at any time the Russian plan. The Russians would have been much more isolated. The Russian troops would have been more isolated west of the Dnieper than they were in the autumn, because the road bridge, the Antonovsky road bridge, has been dismantled by the Russians themselves, by the way. The Kakhovka Dam, of course, constantly under Ukrainian artillery fire, and the fear of the mining, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, one of the factors which caused General Surovikin back in the autumn to decide to withdraw the Russian troops on the West Bank. That concern would always have been there. So I have to say that if the Ukrainians really did think in the way that Shoigu says, they're probably wrong. I don't think the Russians would have crossed the Dnieper this time to reoccupy Kherson, certainly not until the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye region has fully run its course. But of course, the Ukrainians, for their part, might not know that, and they might conceivably be worried that the Russians might do this very thing, retake Kherson city, reoccupy Kherson region, and of course, just as the recapture of Kupiansk by the Russians would be psychologically enormously damaging for Ukraine, reversing the key gain of the autumn offensive in Kharkiv region, so the reversal of the gains achieved in the Kherson counter-offensive of the autumn would be an even greater psychological blow and might shock and dismay the West. Now, given how important presentation, PR, optics, call it what you like, is to Ukraine and to the way that it conducts its war, I can just about see why Ukraine might think in this way and why they might take precautions like perhaps blowing up the dam, flooding the area, acting to stop a Russian amphibious advance across the Dnieper. So I can just about understand the thinking on the Ukrainian side here, even though, as I said, I don't personally think that this is what the Russians were planning to do. Anyway, these are the views, these are the claims that each side has made. Now, I think we do have a bit more information about what has happened to the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. And I wanted to say again that I've had some invaluable help from various members of the community. And before I discuss the more technical claims that some people have been making, engineers, people of this kind, people who have knowledge of these matters, members of the community, I should point out that there's been one message from one person who has floated an intriguing possibility. This is that Ukraine, as discussed many times, is actually, in fact, none too keen on launching this offensive at all. The Ukrainians know perfectly well the enormous risks of this offensive, and they've basically been strong-armed into launching it by their Western backers. And you could argue, and it is a plausible argument, that the destruction of the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, for them, serves as a perfect excuse that they can hide behind if they decide to call the offensive off. They can say that without the amphibious assault on Kherson region, which they've now effectively admitted they were planning, the ability to launch this offensive in Zaporozhye region against the Russians, who will now be able to concentrate all their forces to repel this offensive, that this has now become impossible, and for that reason, if for no other, then they can go back to their Western partners and say, well, look, we can't do it anymore. We can't, one of the key parts of our plan for an offensive has failed, so let's postpone, let's wait until the F-16s come and we can change, and the M1 Abrams tanks come, and then we can try again. Now, I think that's possible, but I have to say, it's not what the Ukrainians are saying at the moment, and of course it's not what the West wants to hear. The West has made it pretty clear that they still want this offensive to happen, and for their part, the Ukrainians are giving everybody assurances that even though this event has complicated the offensive, it will not, in effect, prevent it from being prosecuted. So, anyway, we'll see what the Ukrainians do, and of course they may change their tune at some point over the next few days. Now, the first thing to say is that I have had some very interesting comments, emails, private emails from various people, one from an engineer based, I believe, in Florida, another person from, well, various people. And interestingly, some of these commentaries tend to coincide, and it's been suggested that the expectations many people have of some huge explosion being the indicator of the breaking of the dam, of explosive devices being placed on the dam, that this is actually not the way that explosive devices that struck the dam would work. And there seems to be, the suggestion is that what probably happened is that some kind of explosive boats or torpedoes or drones of the sort that, of course, Ukraine has used, or at least perhaps larger versions of the kind of drones that Ukraine has used in carrying out attacks on Russian ships in the Black Sea, something of that kind. Anyway, that this is what was used, and that if such a explosive projectile, water projectile, struck at the center of the sluice gates, the weakest part of the dam, that would be consistent with the type, it would cause damage which would be consistent with the type of damage shown in the early photographs. And it's been suggested that two of these vehicles might have been used in that way, and one could have struck the sluice gates, causing the damage that we've seen, and another might have veered somewhat to the right and caused a secondary detonation, which we have also pictures of which would also be consistent with some of the pictures we have seen. And that seems to me to be actually a reasonable hypothesis. And I would say that it was something that I know that back in the time when the Russians were still occupying the west bank of Kherson region, they were generally concerned about. They were worried that Ukraine might send these kind of craft with explosives downstream to strike the dam in exactly this way. And I know that the Russians at that time were taking precautions against that kind of possibility. Whether they were still taking precautions, or whether their guard slipped, or what the other reason was why this happened, whether these boats or devices were refined in some way to make them more stealthy. I mean, I don't know. But anyway, that might have been what happened, and it does seem a reasonable theory. There still continues to be another school of thought which says that the dam was brought down through water pressure and as a result of cumulative neglect and damage. Many people have pointed out that Ukrainian infrastructure right across Ukraine is not in good shape, and the dam, it seems, was not in particularly good condition either, and there's been problems with the road bridge and over the dam, and it's been the target of continuous shelling by Ukraine. So maybe, quite possibly, plausibly, the accumulating water pressure in the Kakhovka reservoir was enough in itself to cause the dam to break. And there is an interesting sub-school of thought which says that Ukraine was doing that deliberately, that they were raising the water levels in the Kakhovka reservoir in order precisely to put pressure on the dam in order to cause it to break, and that this might be another way in which Ukraine caused this dam to be breached, separate from the idea of the explosive devices that we've been hearing so much about, which I've just been discussing. Well, I'm not an engineer. I'm not going to say which is correct, which theory is correct, and which is not. What I will say is this. I'm going to repeat again. Ukraine has launched multiple attacks on this dam over many months. Its officials have spoken about destroying this dam. There are claims made in the West that Ukraine has attacked other energy infrastructure as well, including, of course, the Nord Stream pipelines. I'm skeptical about those claims, but Western officials continue to repeat them. So Ukraine has a history of attacking energy infrastructure like this, especially when it's Russian-controlled. Ukraine has actually destroyed dams earlier in the war, caused flooding in order to slow down the advance of Russian troops. This would not be out of character, and it's something that Ukraine has previously said that it would do, that it might be prepared to do. And, of course, if Shoigu and many others, what they say is true, that Ukraine has been releasing water into the Kakhovka reservoir from the Dnieper hydroelectric station. It's been increasing the water going into the reservoir, compensating for the water that's exiting through where the Kakhovka dam used to be, increasing in other words the water flow, and increasing the flooding, the scale of the flooding. Then all I can say is that that is perhaps the single most damning thing of all, and that would considerably strengthen the case that it was Ukraine that was responsible for this. If it was Ukraine which was responsible for this attack, this breach of the dam, and as I said, the case is strongly circumstantial, it's a circumstantial one, but it's a strong one, then I would say that Shoigu's explanation is probably the most plausible one, and that even if the Russians haven't been planning a strike across the Dnieper to retake Kherson city and the West Bank, Kherson region on the West Bank, I can imagine that it's something that Ukraine might not want to risk, and flooding the area in this way, making the Dnieper an impassable obstacle, might be something that they might decide to do if it is indeed their plan to redeploy their forces from Kherson region to Zaporozhye region in order to reinforce there. And of course, when people like Mikhailo Podolyak say that it's now impossible to conduct an amphibious operation across the Dnieper, something that Ukraine clearly planned to do, of course, that now gives them the excuse for that redeployment, and perhaps, in a kind of a way, strengthens Shoigu's claim. Now, I want to stress this is far from conclusive, but I think it's all that can be said about this. I'm going to finish this discussion of the dam and the issue of the dam by referencing another email from someone else who's said that while he understands the nature of the devastation and the suffering there, he must point out that this is not perhaps the colossal disaster that some people are saying. Water levels have risen, many houses have been flooded, large numbers of people have been evacuated, but globally things like this happen in many places, and often sometimes on a far greater scale. So I think that is a point to make. Perhaps this isn't going to have quite the catastrophic long-term consequences that some people worry. And for the record, and this is a surprising fact, I haven't yet heard of a single case of anybody who has died as a result of this. Perhaps some people have, perhaps there have been those reports and I have missed them, but for the record, I haven't heard them. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say about the Kakhovka Dam. I've given this incident a lot of time. There's been, as I said, a Security Council debate where basically people traded allegations but didn't say very much. Western governments, interestingly, have been very, very cautious about what they want to say about this incident. They've not rushed, as they've done on previous occasions, and blamed the Russians, which makes me think that they perhaps do think, or perhaps know, that it was in fact Ukraine that was involved, perhaps for the kind of reasons that Shoigu has given. But anyway, I think that for the moment we have exhausted this topic and there is little further that I can add to it. I'm now going to go to what Shoigu says about Ukraine's offensive, because it is interesting, and it's in the same statement. And he says the following, and it's a statement made on the 6th of January at 15:30 hours Moscow time. Over 3 days, the Ukrainian regime launched a long-promised offensive in different areas of the front, concentrating large quantities of hardware and manpower for this purpose. On 4th June, the 23rd and 31st Mechanized Brigades of the Ukrainian military attempted an offensive in 5 directions. The enemy did not succeed in any of them and suffered significant losses: 300 servicemen, 16 tanks, 26 armoured fighting vehicles and 14 motor vehicles. On 5th June, the Kiev regime attempted an offensive in 7 directions with 5 brigades. The enemy was stopped and suffered even greater losses: more than 1,600 troops, 28 tanks, including 8 Leopard tanks, I'm going to come to that shortly, and 3 AMX-10 wheeled tanks, 136 other military vehicles, including 79 foreign manufactured ones. The attempted offensive was thwarted, the enemy was stopped, and Russian troops showed courage and heroism in the fighting. The enemy failed to achieve its goals and suffered considerable and incomparable losses. And then he discusses at length the courage and bravery of Russian forces. He identifies the 433rd Motorized Rifle Regiment of the 127th Motorized Rifle Division of the Russian Army, the 37th and 60th Motorized Rifle Brigades of the Russian Army, and in particular the 3rd Company of the 37th Motorized Rifle Brigade, and the 1st Battalion of the same brigade, commanded respectively by Junior Lieutenants Yuri Zhelanov and Major Vladimir Polozhentsev. And apparently these people are going to be decorated. Anyway, they all successfully withstood these Ukrainian attacks. These Russian troops withstood these Ukrainian attacks. And at some point, the Ukrainians also committed the 37th Marine Infantry Brigade. Now, this is the most interesting of the brigades that Ukraine committed to this fighting, because it is one of the 9 brigades that has been trained and equipped by the Western powers for the Zaporozhye offensive. I get the sense that the other Ukrainian troops who were involved have not been trained by the West, but of course they might have been trained by Ukraine. There's supposed to be 12 brigades committed to this offensive in total, and then and it could be that some of these other units that we've been hearing about are elements or drawn from these 3 brigades that the Ukrainians have trained themselves. And then he gives further information. He says that the Russian Air Force employed 50 anti-tank guided missiles and destroyed 5 tanks and 29 other armoured infantry vehicles. And he says that all in all, during 3 days of fighting in all directions, the losses suffered by the Ukrainian army amounted to 3,715 troops. That is a staggering number. 52 tanks, 207 armoured fighting vehicles, 134 motor vehicles, 5 aircraft, 2 helicopters, 48 pieces of field artillery, and 53 unmanned aerial vehicles. And then he talks about Russian losses. Unfortunately, we have some losses too. A total of 71 servicemen died and 210 were wounded in repelling the enemy offensive by the combined group of forces. 15 tanks, 9 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 motor vehicles, and 9 guns were hit. Now, there has been much discussion about these Russian claims about Russian losses. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is now absolutely on a trip to denigrate everything that the Russian military does. The Russian military, by the way, issued an actual statement yesterday explicitly contradicting Prigozhin's claim that the village of Berkhovo near Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, had been abandoned and recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. I said in my program yesterday that there's now video evidence that this place is securely under Russian control. Prigozhin is certainly wrong about this. But anyway, Prigozhin has issued a scathing statement saying that these claims that of what the Russians have, the losses the Russians claim to have inflicted on the Ukrainian forces in all this fighting, that this is absurd. It's straight out of Baron Munchausen, English children's book of the late 18th, early 19th century about a German baron who gave wild and exaggerated stories of his experiences. There's various films featuring him, by the way. Anyway, this is all completely untrue. And to the Russian authorities' embarrassment, the video that they released yesterday of what they said was a attack on a Leopard tank, a Leopard 2 tank, by a Russian helicopter gunship, the Kakhovka, as I understand it. Well, that has been taken apart and ridiculed by Ryba, the Russian collective of journalists which publishes much of the most interesting and often reliable accounts of the fighting. They say that what is shown in the picture, what the helicopter pilot attacked, isn't actually a tank at all. It is in fact a combine harvester. Well, I've looked at the film. I'm afraid I'm not able to help here at all. It's all very indistinct to me. I can't tell whether it's a tank or a combined harvester. My eyesight isn't good enough, and I don't have that kind of photographic analysis. So on that, I'm afraid I give a complete pass. I'm not able to say. But having said this, I don't think we can discount these claims by Shoigu entirely. Putting aside that rather unfortunate film of the Leopard 2 tank or the combine harvester being destroyed, there's lots and lots of pictures of large numbers of Western vehicles that have been destroyed. Not just Western vehicles, all kinds of vehicles that have been destroyed. I mean, the landscape seems to be littered with them. So that does seem to me to at least corroborate in part some of what Shoigu is saying. As for the 52 tanks which the Russians say they destroyed, and if I can just come back to that film of the supposed Leopard 2, which might be, perhaps is, a combine harvester. That, of course, was attacked and destroyed by a Kakhovka 52 helicopter gunship. But note that that Shoigu says that only 5 of the 52 tanks Ukraine used were destroyed by helicopter gunships. So, at least, even if one assumes that all 5 Leopard 2s were attacked by helicopter gunships, and that they were all of them, in fact, combine harvesters. Some of the other vehicles, tanks that were destroyed, would have been destroyed by artillery, by ground troops engaging the Ukrainians in combat in some form. But anyway, we're talking about 52 tanks in total, 47 of which destroyed in ground fire, and Shoigu says that 15 Russian tanks were hit as well. So that does look to me like evidence of a fairly intense tank battle. Perhaps the Russians are overstating Ukrainian losses. Probably they are. And I have to say that 71 Russian soldiers killed, 210 wounded, against a combined total of 3,715 dead and wounded on the Ukrainian side. That does seem an improbably lopsided rate of loss on the Ukrainian side, even though, of course, the Russians are fighting from defended positions. But if one puts all that aside, again, 71 Russian soldiers killed, 210 wounded. Again, it points to fierce fighting, intense fighting, and that again suggests that probably, almost certainly, Ukrainian losses were high. I think that almost certainly Shoigu's figures are wrong, that they're off by several, perhaps by an order of magnitude. But I do get the sense that Ukraine did suffer very heavy losses indeed in these attacks, that they did lose an awful lot of equipment, certainly a lot of armoured vehicles and soft-skinned vehicles. Probably they did lose tanks. Some of them, I'm starting to have doubts that any of them were Leopard 2s, by the way. It seems that there's some skepticism about whether they were Leopard 2s. And as I very well remember, during the Kherson offensive, Ryba, which has set out to debunk the Defense Ministry's claim about this film showing a Leopard 2 being destroyed. Ryba itself, way back in early stages of the Kherson offensive, was reporting that the Ukrainians at that time were using Leopard 2s, when in fact it turned out that they were using T-72s and T-64s. And it could be that Ukraine did use a fair amount of tanks in these attacks, but I suspect quite possibly they were Russian-produced tanks, and there might be some errors and misidentification going on here. The only thing I would say, and I would repeat this again, is that Shoigu is not saying that all of the tanks that were knocked out were Leopard 2s. He says only 8 of them, 8 out of the 52 were. So perhaps the Russians do have some means of identifying these Leopard 2s. One can't be absolutely sure. But anyway, he gives an account of Ukraine having suffered extremely heavy losses in these attacks. And I think that even if we can perhaps take this figure of 3,715 killed with some skepticism, it does seem to me that Ukraine must have probably lost several hundred men, perhaps more than that, in attacks launched all along the line, drawn from significant Ukrainian military units, none of which has achieved any kind of breakthrough at all. And I suspect that the major reason for this discrepancy, for these heavy losses, is that these troops have gone into attack without any real artillery preparation, with no real protection from Russian artillery fire. There doesn't seem to be any kind of counter-battery work done. It all looks as if it was a rather chaotic attack by Ukraine, not perhaps particularly well organized, and it led to the very heavy losses that we see. So that's where we stand over the last few days. Ukrainian attacks all along the front line, many different places, all of them repulsed. Russian units still held their positions north of the major fortified lines that the Russians have created. And Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, has now repeated his call. Once this offensive is finally defeated, once it's been fully repelled, what Russia needs to do, finally, is to go on the offensive. They've built up their forces in the rear. They have thousands more tanks than Ukraine has. They're far better equipped with artillery than Ukraine is. Ammunition issues have been resolved, if they ever existed. So Medvedev says that once the offensive is concluded, it is time for Russia to go on the attack. And perhaps that, again, going back briefly to the Novaya Kakhovka dam affair, perhaps that again fits in with what the Ukrainians did. If you believe Shoigu, then maybe the Ukrainians did blow up the dam, destroy the dam, because they don't want to keep their troops isolated west of the Dnieper, and because they do eventually fear a Russian offensive that might one day come, even if perhaps not immediately, which is what Medvedev is talking about. And they don't want some of their best troops marooned west of the Dnieper in Kherson region, where they're not serving any useful purpose. In which case, Ukrainian thinking about Kherson is not, in some respects, that different from the thinking that General Surovikin adopted back in the autumn when he decided to pull the Russian troops out. Well, that's where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. We'll see whether or not Ukraine goes on the attack again and what it does. And of course, in the meantime, as we've been talking about all of these things, all sorts of other things, all sorts of other news is building up. But that's me for today. As I said, more from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also go to our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. Remember, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you, and to tick the like button to this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.